So, hi everyone, thanks so much for joining and welcome to this webinar organised by TDI Sustainability and Mining 2030 on redefining mine legacy and the role of finance in achieving positive legacies. I'm Gemma James, I'm with Kronos Sustainability, and Kronos is acting as the Secretariat for Mining 2030. Mining 2030's vision is a socially and environmentally responsible mining sector by 2030, and we've set out on a process to identify how investors can facilitate the industry in reaching this vision. Part of that vision has been to define what is meant by legacy. And to do that, we've been working with TDI to develop a definition which we would like to socialise with you today. And this is very much a start of a conversation and also a start of a consultation process that will be coming online soon. So currently there is no agreed definition of legacy, and what is out there often narrowly frames legacy in quite a negative light. And what we saw was needed is a more holistic definition of legacy that encompasses those negative historic legacies, but also the planning and responsible of closure of mines and the creation of positive legacies from new and existing mining. And with this, we want to identify how investors can then support the industry in addressing those negative legacies and also to create and sustain a positive legacy. So today our speakers are going to present that definition that has been developed. It's very much a draft definition. And then we're going to discuss the rationale behind the diagnostics that have been used within that definition. So I'm going to first introduce, we have an amazing panel of speakers for you today. So first up, we have Jill Cooper. So Jill is a Director of Responsible Investing at Orion Resource Partners. That's a private equity fund providing investment capital to companies in the mining and minerals industry. And she is also on the Mining 2030 Steering Committee and is one of the co-chairs of the Legacy Working Group with Zach Wood. And she's our investor representative on the panel today, so she will provide the investor perspective on legacy. So welcome, Jill. We then have Asherton Carter. So Asherton is the CEO of TDI Sustainability, obviously brings a huge amount of a wealth of experience from the sector with him. And Asherton and his colleague Soledad Mills at TDI have been leading the development of the definition that you're going to hear about today, and also that diagnostic of legacy. And they've been working very hard in developing this draft. So great that you could join us today, Asherton, as well. We then have Pete Whitbread-Abratat. So Pete is a specialist in mine closure and has been involved with some very significant post-mining restoration projects around the world, such as the transformational Eden project in the UK. He is also the lead author of a book on 102 things to do with a hole in the ground. So you may have seen that on the shelves. And Pete's experience is really going to help us identify those positive case studies for post-closure. And then we have Erin Parham. So Erin is an environmental consultant. She's also been part of the team developing the definition on legacy, working with TDI. Erin is a biodiversity expert. She's also been working with the mining industry for the past few years. So she's been applying that ecological expertise to the development of the definition. So it's really great to have you as well with us, Erin. So thanks all for joining. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights and how we rethink and redefine legacy. I'm going to just set out the agenda for today's session. So first, Ashton's going to provide us with an overview of the definition that's out for will be out for consultation. We'll then bring in Erin, Pete and Jill for a panel discussion to dive deeper into the definition and diagnostic. And then we'll open the floor for some audience Q&A. So please do send through your questions throughout the session. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you can pop those into, and we'll look at those towards the end. We've got someone monitoring those questions, so we'll have a look to see which ones we can ask. And then just before I hand over to Asherton, just to note that we are holding this webinar to provide some more context to the definition and for the experts today to discuss a bit more around the rationale and how we got to this draft definition. And as I mentioned earlier, this is very much part of a consultation process. So we will be making all of the relevant documents, and the links will be available on the Mining 2030 website soon. We'd love to gain as much feedback as possible from everyone. So this will very much provide the basis for our approach to legacy within Mining 2030 as a whole. And we'll send those links around to you once they are ready. So with that, I am going to hand over to Asherton to get us started. Thanks, Asherton.
Great. Thanks very much, Gemma. So in some ways, this isn't a new topic, and probably since I started studying mining and sustainability in the mid-90s, the question of what to do with mining developments once the economic value has been exhausted and who should take responsibility for mitigating any of the effects of the consequences of mining has continually been asked, and suggestions for and solutions have been written up in guidance and standards, some of which appear in the paper. So in some ways, there's no shortage of literature, but this paper and this initiative more generally of 2030 is particularly important now, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is that the attention on this topic given by the investor community, which of course is the core audience of the 2030 Mining 2030, and the importance they're giving to mine legacy and the importance of the investor community to the mining industry, which needs the investment from them and for the economies that are going to rely on minerals for the transition to cleaner economies. And so this paper has a perspective, and that is from the point of view of the investor who have to consider legacy because of the compliance, the reputation, and the financial risks, and particularly relevant now because of the uptick in the interest in mining generally and minerals development generally, but also kind of recent surveys have shown that 40% of mines are due to close by 2040, and 20% of mines in the next 5 years by 2030. There's a very good workshop by BNP, hosted by BNP Paribas in London the other day, and their study talked about the increase since 2013 to the current day of closure liabilities in the oil, gas, nuclear, and mining sector, with a gross increase of 528 billion to date since 2013. So, this is now an issue which is rightly getting a lot of attention. So the mandate that TDI was given under Mining 2030 is to write up a definition of legacy that can be understood by the institutional investors, but hopefully more broadly as well. So that when it goes out for consultation in the coming weeks, you'll see the actual definition, and the discussion around it is just 5 pages, and then there's another 25 pages of annexes, and we look forward to hearing the feedback from all of you. So what I thought I'd cover today then is looking at some of the kind of the highlights from the paper and some of the thinking behind it. I think it's useful to start by looking at or talking about some of the dimensions of legacy. So I think first of all, there's a temporal dimension here. The concept of mine closure can imply an end point. There is a deposit that has been exhausted, the business of mining is done, and the site is returned to the host. Legacy, on the other hand, is about the enduring consequences of mining. The effects and the impacts of mining, of course, can surface years or even decades later in the mining cycle and post-mining. When Pete talks, I'm sure my colleague Pete will talk about the ecological consequences of this. And here in the UK, of course, there have been many efforts in Cornwall to plant trees on old tin sites, and those haven't worked at all, but the mine has long gone. The slow death of mining towns and mining communities can be seen all over the world, from Virginia to Windhoek. So the temporal dimension is something we have to consider. Then there's the spatial dimensions. Again, the concept of closure can sometimes be inferred to mean to be restricted just to the operating site itself. But the enduring consequences of mining are felt really in the communities nearby mines, along the linear infrastructure, the transport routes or the energy transmission, and also where minerals are processed. This is all part of the all part of a legacy of mining. And so we need to consider not just the site, but also the community and even the landscape, the country, and even the region. And so doing so allows us to consider the greater responsibilities that other actors can have within that landscape. And then I'll come to that later. Another dimension is looking at the risk aspects of mining, and those different perspectives that brings. So in the past, you'll see that much of the literature of closure is framed around the technical aspects of the environmental or the physical parts of closure. But of course, more recently in my own work, the focus has to be on the economic aspects of this and how does that endure? What is the promise of mining that is manifest in the economic uptake or uptick in the economic consequences of the communities around the mine? And then there's the kind of the social cohesion, the community cohesion around the mine as well, and even the psychological aspects of this. I remember one project that I worked on where there was this relationship between the physical aspects of the mine and the psychological, where the mine was going to take down a mountain, but instead what they did was keep the face of the mountain that was seen by the community standing and mine behind it because the psychological impact was deemed to be too great. And then also there's the financial risk, which I'm sure many will talk about today, which is how the investor community sees the liabilities associated with mining. Another dimension is the responsibility and the governance. So who is going to take the responsibility for mitigating or compensating for these risks, all these impacts that happen because of the consequences of mining, the activities of mining, and whose rules should they follow? So large industrial mines can, divest an operation, for example, when the profit hurdle rate fails to meet their expectations, and pass it on to a smaller miner with less expectations, who then takes on the liabilities. Does the government have the financial capacity to pay for the mitigation, and for how long? And how about the communities? Or should we even be looking even further downstream and look to see who should pay for the liabilities of mine for the cobalt in a battery or the gold in jewelry, for example? And then finally, there's the dimension of the actual kind of impact, impact positivity scale, if you want. We should consider mining not just about the negative things and how to mitigate those, but actually the positive impacts of mining. And in the context of this study and this work of Mining 2030, it's really about how we can envision what is a positive legacy. So our definition talks about a positive legacy of mining, because as responsible investors who are in Mining 2030, that is really the North Star. So those are some of the dimensions. We go on to the next slide then. So what we then envision then is something kind of more practical in its applicability, and what are the different paradigms that we can use, the different models that we can use to understand a legacy, a mining legacy. So we put three up here. One of these is the roadmap. So this is a more kind of pragmatic, and for some, I think this will be familiar. So what is the kind of proactive and progressive closure for planning that an operator can put in place and follow through? That this can follow some of the good work that the ICMM, International Council of Mining Metals, has worked for many years on in their integrated mine closure approach. So we can consider legacy as a model of how do you do this from the point of view of the mine and those stakeholders who have interests in that mine. A little bit more conceptual, we can look at the transformation and look at legacy as transformation. So rather than consider mining as a kind of a linear process, a point in time, which has a beginning, middle, and end, think about what it can actually be driving towards. So what is the end state that we envision after mining? It's not just about restoring to what it was before, it's envisioning what it's going to be in the future. And so then this pushes the boundaries a little bit to look at, regenerative business and looking at responsibilities outside of the fence. So how can mining and the stakeholders of miners begin to repurpose the areas around the mine and begin doing that whilst the mine is actually in operation. And how can the resource extraction contribute to a long-term healthier state, or a healthy state that is different from what it was when it began? And of course, all this requires stakeholder engagement to be part of that, envisioning process. Remembering that, once the mine is closed, then the operators move on to the next one. So what's the most important here is the vision that those stakeholders have. So that's another model. A third model, of course, which is I kind of think is like the most important, which is the governance framework. We need to look at legacy through the prism of a governance framework of who is actually going to be managing this transition, who is going to be responsible for ensuring the participation of different actors in a landscape, in a post-mining landscape, and what are the rules that they should follow. And so looking at a legacy through a lens of governance is another an important model, and one that we include in the paper. Next slide. So some of the challenges and opportunities of mine that we put in the paper. So the financial provisioning is one, of course, which is extremely acute from the point of view of this piece of work. And when you speak to institutional investors, of course, what they're beginning now to do is trying to understand what are the costs of closure. And some of the studies have shown that this can be underestimated by 10 times and sometimes 40 times. It's very difficult to estimate that, especially when the prices of a mineral might go up, the size of the mine might grow, and the social and the movement of people around the mine might change as well, and you have difficulty envisioning what that future can be 40, 60, over 100 years ahead. And so that kind of feeds into the financial assurances. It looks like how do you kind of value a balance sheet, and how do you put in place the appropriate discounts. And if you were to do that, and you were to do it properly, and you were to kind of fully cost it, if you could, what would that mean for the what would that mean for the interest rate, or what would that mean for the terms that investors use when they're looking at mines? Looking at the regulatory and governance challenges, I've touched on a few of those, but across the globe, they're very uneven legal frameworks. There's centralized government models, and then there's those which are very decentralized. And so it's difficult to predict what is going to be the compliance, risks, and also what are the expectations of the host governments. Social and community challenges, I'm sure we can all envision these. What are going to be the long-term community impacts, both physical, psychological, social, and cultural? And how do you begin to put in place feedback loops so those can be incorporated into the planning for closure? And environmental challenges, which some of my colleagues will talk about today, especially in a changing climate. Just because you have one species of tree, for example, in an area doesn't mean that's going to be the appropriate species in the future. So you're dealing with two things at once: how to restore, regenerate within a moving target of climate change and the need for climate adaptation. Go to the next slide. So some of the things which I'm sure we'll discuss, some of the key success factors of positive legacies. Very clear that if we're going to get this right, we need to have a guiding vision of positive legacy. And of course, that means the fourth bullet down, that we need to bring in those stakeholders to co-envision what that future state will be. Some of the lessons we've learned from, such as the ICMM guidance on closure, we need to start right from the very beginning. This isn't something you just tag on the end. To be economically, technically, and socially feasible, we need to start right at the beginning. And that, of course, requires the adequate financial provisioning. And, one thing we're looking at, one thing that we heard at the BNP Paribas workshop that I mentioned this earlier, is are there new actual financial instruments or products that can be used for closure in particular. So closure bonds is one of the things that came up. Technical excellence, environmental rehabilitation. The mining industry is actually probably the leader when it comes to restoration ecology. How do we make sure that that is purposed for the future and can be applied at different scales of mining with different economic profiles? Systems levels approaches, strong regulatory frameworks. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And again, the post-closure governance and accountability. So final slide, I think. So what I thought I'd do there would leave you with the defining mining legacy, the definition that we have come up with for positive mining legacy. This is very much a working definition that we've crafted and should be seen or read in the context of the other models and dimensions that I mentioned previously. So thanks you, Gemma. I'll leave it there and hope that was useful to frame a discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ashton. That was very clear in laying out the definition, and it gives us the listeners a sense of the different pillars and the lens that we can look at legacy through. So what we'll do is we'll now move into our panel session so that we can start unpicking some of these elements of the definition that Ashton has set out for us. And before we start unpicking this definition, I wanted to just first take a step back and understand why we embarked down this road in the first place. So why did we start looking at developing a definition on legacy? Jill, can we start with you, just as the co-chair for the Legacy Working Group of Mining 2030? So why do we need a definition, and what are the shortcomings of those existing definitions that are out there?
Thank you, Gemma. And Ashton did a great job answering much of the question of why do we need a definition. And from an investor perspective, and by the way, my comments are my own opinions, not those of Orion. As an investor, working for an investor, I need to say that. But what we found is there's not that many investors that are solely focused on mining and minerals. So we're very comfortable in the space. But we spent a lot of time talking to other investors and our investors about what does it mean to be funding mining projects in a responsible manner. So a definition is really key to help investors and others understand what's possible into the future, instead of the perception that legacy is going to be a negative thing. Let's raise the bar and look at legacy from a more positive opportunity. And where can investors and other stakeholders help mines move further in that space? There's some, like Ashton said, on environmental that they have done very well in the industry for years, and they can still do better. So I think the shortcoming of the current definition, and it's not really a written definition, it's more of a concept people have, is that the legacy is going to be negative. And we'd really like to see what it looks like to shift that to a positive legacy. You will have some negative impacts from mining, but how do you, as a holistic, from the beginning of life of mine, we call it LOM, through to the end of the mine, how do you start thinking about these things as a positive legacy and more focus on social in addition to the environmental? But thank you for the question.
Great, thanks, Jill. And both you and Ashton have reflected on, I guess, that positive opportunity that the mining industry can actually leave. And that's what this new definition actually encompasses. It's also quite a multifaceted concept that cuts across lots of different sort of scales and time to different types of assets. So I thought we could just think a little bit more around some of the roots into the definition. So Pete, if I come to you, so with legacy, we often think about the physical assets of a mine that are left behind and the physical nature of the land and the ecology at the site. What would you say are some of the less tangible aspects of legacy that don't receive as much focus?
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thanks very much to Ashton and Jill for framing the discussion so far. So the first thing I would say is when we develop a new mine, we get told that every mine is unique. It's a unique response to its local geology, political, financial, geographical context. But the same also applies, therefore, to what happens at the other end of the mine when it's running down and closing. The mine closure vision and plan should reflect that context. And too often, as we've already heard, it fits more of a technical environmental perspective. in terms of managing environmental risks and impacts, rather than giving the same amount of focus on community and social aspects. So I've just brainstormed a list here, but one of the key things that I'm interested in at the moment is this idea of sense of place, this cultural perspective on what makes a land into landscape, how people perceive a place as somewhere they belong, whether that's somewhere that they come from or their ancestors come from, and that's usually tied to physical features, and that can also be tied to mining infrastructure and mining buildings and mining landforms as well. So understanding that sense of place when we're developing a mine closure plan, or I prefer to use the word mine transition plan, can actually help with leveraging a better connection between people and the post-mining landscape. And a way into driving this social transition is by involving local communities in particular in a much more meaningful way than is generally been done in the past. So we talk about community engagement, we talk about community consultation, but I prefer to use the word participation, which means that the local people have some skin in the game on the decisions that are going to affect their lives after the mine is gone. And that means the mining companies and the other stakeholders have to be open and transparent and help build trust to enable a proper dialogue and all the rest of it. Tied to that are things like inclusivity, collaboration, and including what I call unusual suspects as well. Some of the people around some of the most impressive post-mining projects in the world are not the mining engineers, they're not the environmental scientists or regulators, but they're people that have come in from left field with creative minds or progressive approaches that wouldn't otherwise normally be included in those conversations. And we need to think a way of somehow engaging them in an open way and helping them become part of the process, because quite often they'll produce amazing things like the Eden Project and some of the other examples that we'll talk about later. I also think the deeper we can get communities involved in this sharing of ideas and solutions leads towards building trust and the fairer sharing of benefits during mining development. And after mining development, whatever post-mining landforms and infrastructure and services are left behind can also aid that benefit sharing. So if we can get better at designing post-mining landforms that are not just safe, stable and non-polluting, but also stable erosionally, fit with the local landscape context, and provide opportunities for developing nature positive outcomes as well as better land uses for local people, then I think we've hit the jackpot.
Great, thanks, Pete. And that reminds me is we also have another work stream on Mining 2030 looking at stakeholder engagement, effective stakeholder engagement and benefit sharing as well. It's another consultation that's out at the moment. So maybe we need to get your ideas on how that to get your feedback on that through that consultation. But Erin, just coming to you, I mean, Pete's talked about the uniqueness of these different mine sites, and obviously each of these aspects will play out differently in different contexts depending on what is needed and how different stakeholders are involved, what are the actions that have been done in the past and how those plans have been made. And it's actually worth pointing out that all of our speakers are also sitting in quite different jurisdictions at the moment. So you've all seen different variations of legacy. And Erin, you're in South Africa, which has a lot of legacy mines out there. Can you talk us through how mining legacy might be understood or managed differently across different jurisdictions and different regions?
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks, colleagues. Through our research, we really found that many of the key differences stemmed from governance. And those economically developed countries, typically, they had more that had more comprehensive mine legacy and regulations and frameworks. Those were countries that had much longer and extensive mining histories usually. So like the USA and Canada, Chile, Peru, Australia. They commonly required quite detailed and updated closure plans. They required that secured financial provisions for mine closure, and they had really clear liability timelines. Some countries like Australia and Canada, they even had government enforcement and bond mechanisms. Those provided that really focused oversight on that compliance and performance. When we contrast that, we found that commonly those less economically developed countries often don't have the clear post-closure responsibilities or the ability or the capacity to enforce regulations. And that mining legacy risk, that main legacy risk here, is that mines are often poorly rehabilitated or they're orphaned. That then shifts the risk, the responsibilities, and the reclamation costs to the government and to taxpayers. But even within these two governance groupings, we saw that there were regional differences in how the financial assurances are required and how they're enforced. For example, here in South Africa, so while there is a robust mechanism for securing mine closure rehab funds, accessing these funds by companies in a timely and a really efficient way can be quite a challenge. And then we have other countries, such as Germany, such as the USA, they maintain funds that are there specifically for that perpetual care of closed and abandoned mine sites. And that really helped to offset that public financial burden. I think through it all, though, we really saw that investors can play quite an important role here to strengthen that governance. They can do that through requiring the independent assessments of closure liabilities and forecasting, and to encourage that regular public disclosure of their closure progress. Those can then be conditions of their investment to help drive the strength and governance overall.
Great, thanks, Erin. And you've also just made the link for me for another Mining 2030 work stream that we have. As you can see, where I think legacy is very much a cross-cutting issue, but we have also been looking at policy and regulation and what makes a good mining code, and what is it that the governments need in terms of capacity in order to help enforce and implement those. So you've just outlined some of the challenges that they're facing there. I'm conscious, Ashton, I haven't come to you yet, but I've just got one more question for Pete first, if you don't mind. And it's not just sort of the geographical variation of applying this kind of lens that we need to think about. We also need to think about when actions are put into play that they're able to achieve positive legacy, and it often needs to start from the beginning of the mine life. It's not just about that end point of life, and Ashton talks about the enduring impacts of mining. So Pete, how do you think or how should mine legacy be applied across these different stages of the mine life cycle?
Thank you very much. I think that's a really, really important part of the discussion. And again, Ashton framed it very, very well. And I think a way of looking at this is we always talk about mine closure should begin at the beginning of the mining life cycle, which is design, exploration and design phases. But a really good way of framing this is to think of a mine not traditionally just as a part of land in space and time, but as part of a continuing landscape narrative through that place. And if we have that mindset, then the mine is actually just one chapter in that landscape story. And therefore, when the mining ends, it's incumbent upon the miners and its stakeholders to make sure that the next chapter, post-mining chapter, is set up well for a vibrant new extension to the story. So with that mindset in mind, I talk about mine closure planning. It really is a transitional process throughout the life of mine, transitioning from pre-mining land use to a mining land use to a post-mining land use. And if it's done properly, that should occur all the way through the life of mine, so that by the end, when mining actually stops, you have a very good understanding of the risks and costs of any residual liabilities. And if you've done progressive restoration and social transition planning throughout the life of mine, those costs and risks will be well understood and much cheaper to manage in the long term. So briefly, if we take the stages of a mine life cycle as exploration, design, construction, operations, and closure, exploration is an often overlooked part of this, but it's often the first group of people associated with mining that go into an area that then interact with other local people and interact with that local environment. And depending on how they behave and what impacts they have, can set the scene, therefore, for the next chapter, sub-chapter in that mining story. And there's good players, as in all this conversation, there's good players and bad players. And I've seen some really good exploration practices that then clean up their impacts afterwards, or other ones that just leave their huge mining exploration trenches wide open for kids to fall in or wild animals to fall in. Sometimes it might be years and years into the future before that place actually becomes a mine, if ever. So that's the first set, and that's the foundation of what should happen next. And then the design phase, before we actually start building the mine, including the period when the studies like the ESIA and the feasibility studies are happening. Those are the areas where you can really make some early wins on designing what happens post-mining by developing your services, buildings, infrastructure, landforms in a way that will have some kind of post-mining value based on what stakeholders are telling you, and particularly local communities. Again, that design has to be a response to the local context. And that includes technical things like waste management and water management, whether we backfill or produce tailings pastes or whatever it is. Construction is, again, another scaling up of the impacts. It's, as you know, a massive influx of people into an area, lots of disturbance, noise, big yellow vehicles with flashing lights moving around, removal of vegetation, clearance of land and all the rest of it. But there's still opportunities there for building community resilience at an early stage by trying to employ local people, engaging local supply chains, or helping them develop and engaging them, supporting scholarships and apprenticeships. But we have to be aware of the end of construction. There's a huge drop off in employment before the operational phase, and sometimes that can involve hundreds of people losing their jobs. And whatever the expectations are, they might think that they were in there for the long haul. And that has to be managed and planned well in advance, that retrenchment and transitional planning. Then obviously operations, there's when the mine's producing and generating finance, it's an opportunity then to catalyse in a big way what happens next, economic diversification or progressive reclamation of landforms and the ecology, developing transferable skills, wider environmental and landscape improvements, and assisting the development of more resilient institutions in local communities. And finally, we get to this thing we call closure, let's call it the end of the mining chapter, when hopefully everything's been done perfectly, and that land is then handed over to others to benefit from in some way in what I call the process of transition. That's the ideal. It doesn't always happen like that, as you understand. There you go.
Great, thanks for setting out like each individual stage and how important it is, the actions and how they sort of have a knock-on effect over to the next one, and just thinking about, I guess, the specific stages of the mine life cycle, and then Erin's talks also about differences across countries in managing closure. Asherton, and you've mentioned the BMP decommissioning work a few times in your presentation. I mean, one of the issues with legacy has been that closure stage where provisioning for that end of life and post-closure has not really been adequate today. That this could be a webinar in itself, right? So maybe we don't go too deep into this, but you know, we're thinking about liabilities, remediation costs, the potential maintenance in perpetuity, but in the context of us defining, you know, legacy in today, you know, how would mine closure planning and provisioning look differently under this definition compared to the status quo so far?
It's a great question. You know, and I think the question on kind of BMP, I noticed that BMP's workshop was, I think they call it a challenge workshop. And then I think one of the panel members said, well, look forward to the solution workshop. So I think there's still a lot of those challenges they're working through. But, you know, I think what we've been talking about a lot, and those very detailed responses from Pete and Erin and Jill, are kind of what I would call like the mine closure worldview. If we really want to change a system, you know, in the hierarchy of the levers that you can pull to change a system, the worldview is the most important, and the standards and technical things come lower down the hierarchy. So we need to change our worldview, and I think the legacy worldview has to be very different. And the legacy worldview would be, we have a minerals development project that mineral development project can last a minimum of 20 years, could be over 80 years. It's a relatively small footprint compared to agriculture, for example, and it's high wealth generating activity. So how do we ensure in that window that we have, and mining is temporary, when things like agriculture are pretty much permanent, in that window, while that window is open, how can we ensure that the revenue which is generated from that mineral go into the right parts of society in that landscape to ensure that the legacy is a positive one? And I don't know any other industry which generates so much wealth in such a small area, but has been least well captured locally. And so that is the challenge. But we've got to see that as the opportunity rather than always saying, well, as well as looking purely at the way to kind of close down the operations safely and in an environmentally benign way. When we take that and we look to the future, I think is one of the questions in the Q&A is, is it that we want to have the place restored to what it was before? Or in fact, within a landscape perspective, do we want the area around the mine to be something else and you conserve elsewhere? Because you're then looking at what is the best use of land in that area, and it changes the whole thing. So how does that help investors? Well, I think there's a change that needs to happen there as well. And we did a little bit of this work with a big mining company in Brazil, looking at how they can be part of the landscape. And it's about putting the mining company as one actor and one actor only within the landscape around a mineral development, where the other actors can be the government, and it can be other investors in other auxiliary or ancillary industries around that mineral development. So, one of the piece of work we're doing with some DFIs, development finance institutions, is how can you bring in other types of investments with different modalities to where mining investment takes place. So you might have Jill and Orion investing in the mine for 7 years, but how can you bring in other investors to invest into infrastructure, into the auxiliary industries around it, and so on. So if we can take that away from saying not just kind of mining closure, but looking at mineral development legacy, and then it kind of shifts the vision, and I think opens up opportunities for broader investment into more diversified economy where the benefits can be captured locally.
Thanks, Ashton. And I was just thinking of the example of Norway, actually, just thinking if there are some cross lessons with the oil and gas industry, for example, and sharing some of those benefits with society, and how could we learn from other other sectors, basically, and how that plays through. Jill, I don't know if there was anything you just wanted to add from an investor standpoint on that financial provisioning piece, but in addition to that, it'd be great if you could also reflect on other common regulatory, financial, and governance challenges affecting legacy that could be positive or negative.
Yeah, and I can also work to answer the question that came in, number 3, the third question, providing insights and guidance on when responsibility of the company stops concerning mine closure. So what we find, having done due diligence on many mine projects around the world, is some of the common challenges and the differences in the regulatory spectrum. And Mining 2030 has a work stream on the regulatory piece, so that's a good one if anyone wants to weigh in on that. But there are significant variations, as Ashton and others have said, on what is expected and what the governments will do to enforce and require throughout the life of mine through closure. So in certain countries, the company is responsible till everything is done. Like in the US, I'm very comfortable with those regulations. And under today's environmental rules and laws, any company that touched the mine is responsible until the mine is fully closed. So the government can go back after an earlier operator if they were a larger company to get adequate funds to close the mine if a smaller company has gone bankrupt or is no longer there, the current owner goes bankrupt. So in other countries, it's not so clear. And so you'll see companies selling older assets to maybe smaller mid-sized companies or even back to countries to be able to continue the life of mine for a longer period of time. And so the responsibility of the company doesn't end necessarily. It ends in certain countries as soon as they sell it. In other countries, it's never really gone. And you see that reflected in how well closure and legacy is thought of through the life of mine. If we know the country is going to hold a company on the hook all the way through to the end, when a company sells their mine, they actually spend more time looking at the financial viability of who they're selling it to, because they know if that company doesn't do it well, the regulators are going to come back on the first owner or the last owner of the operation and ask them to help cover costs. So that is a common challenge, is the differences in the countries. So investors will look at it and say, we're going to hold you to a standard that's kind of consistent around the world. And it's difficult when the regulators don't look at it the same way. Other challenges are that regulators and the expectations on the social and the community side aren't well defined unless you're using an international standard like Equator Principles or IFC as to what a mine should be doing earlier stages. So and also it's hard for a mine sometimes when they're first starting up and they're trying to get community engagement and agreement to start talking about closure of a mine when they're just first of all talking about opening up the mine. It's a difficult conversation, I think, for some companies to have. So those are a few comments and thoughts and possibly an answer to question number 3.
Great, thanks, Jill. And then Asherton, what we're seeing in terms of these challenges that Jill has outlined, and she's mentioned some differences across the different jurisdictions, which ones would you say are the most sort of common and cross-cutting challenges across the industry?
I mean, I think the most challenging one for companies for sure is the governance issue. So the rules of the game and the unpredictability of that. And as we know in our kind of current environment, if you don't know how to plan ahead, you tend to be nervous about investing. And it's changing the goalposts continuously, and that of course came out with the financial provisioning thing. Is how do you actually put that into your modeling? How do you know how large your liabilities are going to be in the future? I think that's kind of massively consistent. On the kind of more granular level or technical level, if you want, the people like Pete and Erin are very sophisticated when it comes to the biogeophysical aspects of this, how to grow plants in funny places. What always I think flummox mining industry is people. So the social aspects are much more difficult, less easy to predict. And how do we do that? And I think we've got to look at automation in the mining industry. We work in the DRC with small scale mining, and that employs tens of thousands of people. You go across the other side of the country, and you have a mine there which is 70% automated, no people at all. So when you're thinking about mining, you're saying, what is the promise of mining? It's more difficult now and will be in the future to say that we employ people. So one of the questions there is about how do you get mining investment to work outside the fence? And I think that's what we're going to have to give some more thought to now in order to get the license to operate, because people want to benefit from mining, and if they're not employed, and if the taxes and the royalties don't trickle down, how are mining operators going to get their license? So this isn't the reason why, but that's the grist for the mill of the protest for lithium mine in Serbia, for example. They want to understand how those benefits are going to come to their door. So I think what we've got to start doing, as I said previously, is when we're looking at investment, is can we actually get coalition of investors who look at the opportunity of a mineral development area and go, what are the different opportunities here for investment? One of which could be investing in the mine itself, but the others can be investing in the mineral economy around it with an eye for the future of how that can develop.
Great, thanks, Ashton. I think with that, there's that sort of added complexity of when we think about sort of resilience of that particular landscape or community or where the mine is, which brings me on to a question for Erin around, the changes over time with climate change that Ashton mentioned in his presentation, that this was sort of an uncertainty that needed to be considered, and that legacy and what's needed might also need to change. So can you give us a sense of how climate change actually needs to be considered in that mine closure and positive legacy planning?
Absolutely, this is critical, and there is growing recognition amongst mining companies that climate change is having an accelerated and material impact on their operations and their closure plans. We're seeing this in failed waste and tailings facilities that weren't designed to withstand extreme and frequent weather events. We're seeing the environmental rehabilitation become more complex due to changing environmental conditions. But we're also seeing those financial impacts due to operational disruptions or infrastructure vulnerabilities and those increased insurance and closure costs. So the regulators and companies, they are integrating climate change adaptation measures into mine closure planning through their governance, through standards, and also investors, they're encouraging climate adaptation planning as well. Yet we really do need to see much more consistent and much more early consideration of these factors in that mine planning process, in that life cycle of the mine. And I think the key here is for really structured and proactive planning. It's spending the time to understand how the relationships and the measurement of climate risk. It's about exploring climate change scenarios and really stress testing those closure plans against different outcomes and under that banner of uncertainty. And I think it's also about ensuring that the first principles of avoidance and reduction and adaptation and resilience are really embedded in closure plans and in closure visions. And I think all of those will really help to progress and secure those long-term outcomes that are needed for successful mine closure. But also just to say, and it's been touched on as well, and the case studies will bring this out very clearly in this work and also in Pete's 102. But those post-mining transitions, they present such a great opportunity to just demonstrate climate action and to start creating that positive legacy value. So for example, it's through repurposing those post-mining lands for green energy production, supporting those future skills that are needed in a green economy, and it's balancing that grey and that green infrastructure so that we can really strengthen that regional climate resilience. And it has been mentioned before earlier today that effective planning, it needs to involve local communities, local stakeholders, and government stakeholders. And there's tools and frameworks there that can help us guide that process.
Thanks, Erin. And you just mentioned Pete's 102 102 Mines book, which there's a question in the Q&A about. So I'm actually going to come back to Pete in the audience Q&A on maybe a couple of examples from them. So I think we're coming towards the end of the panel discussion. So do keep popping your questions in the Q&A function. We'll deal with those in a second. Just to round off, I think, Jill, we started the panel discussion with you, and I just wanted to finish the last question with you and link it back to the Mining 2030 vision, which we're looking to develop that sort of roadmap for investors to support the mining industry. And I know there's a different spectrum of investors out there, and private equity is just sort of one viewpoint from that. But I mean, from your position, what is the potential role of investors in supporting this idea of positive legacy for mining?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And again, it's the whole purpose of Mining 2030 in some ways, but investors can start with the diligence before you're invested in a project. Make this a part of your diligence. Really look at whether the economics are there. Have they, because it's just part of your financial risk assessment. Have they set aside enough for closure? Are they thinking of bonding, letters of credit? What do the regulators require? Have they approved a closure plan? And then broaden it to interviewing the stakeholder, the people responsible for stakeholder engagement and community. Do they understand the role of legacy in their ongoing job during the life of mine and post closure? So just kind of understanding the the level of experience a company will have. And if you feel like they don't have enough, as an investor, you can ask for conditions, covenants. You can say, we need you to hire an expert, make it part of their environment social action plan, their ESAP. Make sure it's something that you track and you ask them to continue to report on, and it's not just something that ends up in the contract and is never seen again. We track really closely the obligations we're asking our investments to take on, and keep them on task. During investment, we talk about risk, cost, liability, and opportunities. We want the investment to be worth more on the market when we're done and when we're ready to exit. And the stronger the programs that companies have, the more value they'll have on the market, because the market's expectations are changing, with different groups like LME and others asking companies to meet international standards. What we're doing is helping them get ready for the market, because we're often involved very early stage. So an investor's role, no matter where they're, what part of the mining life they're in, is to just keep saying it matters and translating it to reducing risk, cost, liability, and enhancing opportunities. Thanks for that last question.
Great, thanks so much, Jill. And that's the last part of our panel session. So great, thanks for being good sports on that. So we'll go to the audience Q&A now. And I think the first question, just to which I mentioned earlier, is we're looking for some examples of, what does good closure look like, or what can closure look like, and whether they left a positive legacy. So maybe Pete, let's come to you, because you've got 102 examples. Maybe you just have like one or two though.
Well, here's the book. There's actually 111 in there, so there's a few freebies, but I've got two examples that I want to talk about of successful stories in the vein of what we've talked about. And one speaks directly to what Ashton was saying about mine acting as a vehicle or a catalyst for economic and social development. So I won't mention the name of the mine or the business, but it's one of the biggest iron mines in the world, and it's in the northern province of South Africa. And the mine's a huge open pit. It's not due to close for many, many years into the future. But they're in a relatively remote part of South Africa, with a community on the doorstep of thousands and thousands of people. And they're using the mine, they have the brainwave of using the mine as a catalyst to drive economic diversification by using the mine's land holdings and service infrastructure and convening capabilities and financial capital and expertise to help kickstart the development of an agribusiness region, if you like. So they brought in experts on agribusiness development, on piloted and tested all kinds of different crops and growing systems, and that piece of work is underway at the moment. And eventually, and this includes growing things like pecan nut trees on top of 150-meter high waste rock dumps, testing that kind of level of horticultural skill. And ultimately, they're talking about training up and developing agricultural businesses that will employ hundreds and hundreds of people into the future, including small-scale cooperatives doing high-value horticultural produce as well. So that's one example that will help community resilience post-mining when their mining ends, which it will do eventually. And that's the mine driving that, and the mining company. A similarly really good example that I was heavily involved in at the start, going back 25 years, was the Eden project in Cornwall, UK. And Cornwall was a historical nerve centre of hard rock, copper and tin mining, going back 150, 200 years. And most of those mines closed in the early 20th century, and it's a pretty rural, remote part of the UK. It's got a beautiful coastline which has a tourist industry associated with it, thankfully. That stopped a complete collapse of the economy. But basically, the local economy and region outside the coastline has been economically flatlining for 2 or 3 generations, mainly due to post-mining decline. And in the centre of Cornwall is the China clay mining industry, and one of the quarries became available after 160 years of operation, and a guy called Tim Smith came up with a vision of developing a world-class visitor destination and educational charity with 2 huge giant domes housing tropical rainforests and plants that people use from all over the world. Big shiny things that would attract tourists in when on a rainy day like today, and help regenerate the socio-economy of that region. So that guy was Tim Smith. He's originally an archaeologist. He became a record producer and songwriter for people like the Nolan Sisters and Phil Collins. Nothing at all to do with the mining industry. He built a team of collaborators around him, engineers, horticulturists, theatre performers, financialists, investors, and all the rest of it, and created this thing that has converted something like £140 million of regeneration grant investment, including a bit of private investment, to over 2 billion of socio-economic value added to the local economy in 20 years. So there's an example that didn't involve a mining company. And there's a lot more you can read about in that book.
Two amazing examples. So thanks for sharing that. So another question that we got through from the audience was around how can closure costs be considered in an economical analysis so that the value of sustained closure can be visualized? And there's a note there to say that the NPV or net present value isn't very helpful. Jill, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. Yeah, we included in our economic analysis of an overall project when we do the assessment, and we'll look at what they reported to the government and what the government signed off on. We'll also look at independent experts where sometimes they're doing the work for the mine. From time to time, if it's an older asset, we will actually hire an expert who is like a forensic economist in this space or accountant in this space, and they can go through and really figure out what the capex and the opex are, as well as what the potential future costs would be, and you can compare it across. It's not always easy to find, but you can find numbers of actual closure costs, and you have to do time value money and go out in time, the NPV argument. But it's best to have somebody who actually knows what actual closure costs look like, and also look at the time frame. I've seen some where they put closure out, like not tailings closure, but mine and processing facility closure out for 30 to 40 years after the mine shut down. And most countries are going to have you close it within 5. So if they looks like they really stretched out the costs, so those are kind of things that an expert can help you look at. But we actually spend a certain amount of time in our financial analysis before we invest, before we go to our investment committee, figuring out whether they have a realistic number. So there are ways to do that.
Right, thanks so much, Jill. So I'm just looking through the questions. Erin, I know you've responded to one around, an approach to take when local community needs want to, or maybe in conflict with biodiversity. Do you just want to, talk a little bit about that, as we've just got a couple of minutes anyway?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it's a shared challenge across many landscapes and in many contexts. And true sustainable development is meeting the needs of society and nature. So that's the goal here. And when we're talking about creating that resilient future state where nature and society can both persist and thrive, I think one of the ways is to understand what benefits society gets from nature. So we can really look through that lens of ecosystem services here and see how nature and biodiversity is creating benefits. It's it's building, it's regulating, it's providing those services which communities, which businesses, which different actors in a landscape depend on. I think when we understand that, we know what nature and people need in order to thrive and to sustainably develop. So this is where we can start to understand what those trade-offs could be and what those implications are between one land use and one land state versus another. We definitely want to create future landscapes where people and nature are together and not apart. And I think that that's something which has that top-down design, but definitely is built from bottom-up planning. Asherton, I see that you've probably got a lot to add on this as well through lived experience.
Let's just give me maybe I could give an example. One of the first projects I worked on this topic, which was in the southern point of Madagascar, ilmenite mine there called QMM, and we had to kind of evaluate the options, and really the kind of the point of this story is showing that there was a conflict between communities' interests and the aspirations of the essentially kind of the scientific professionals within the company. So, you know, following best practice at that time, you bring in your best scientists and figure out how to restore or replace the biodiversity. And as everybody knows, in Madagascar, everything is precious and in very locally defined areas. So in this bottom end of Madagascar, there is going to be a kind of massive impact across 3 different habitat types. And so the compulsion of the company there was to try and do their best and spend a huge amount of money on restoring examples from those 3 different types of habitat at quite a large cost. But what the local community wanted was fuel wood and wood to light, heat, and cook on. Their homes, and cook on. And of course, the most useful wood for that is the hardwood, which was being kind of replaced anyway. So, you know, we did analysis and goes, well, look, this is going to be lost anyway, because you start opening up this area, the communities are going to increasingly take away that wood for their kind of very basic needs. So in fact, the easiest thing to do here is put in very fast growing eucalyptus, which you can sell at a far cheaper price because it's less useful as a fuel wood. And your conservation dollars, you need to invest in the park down the road, expand that, and it's only got 1 guard, so let's kind of quadruple that. And then in terms of your net benefit, it's going to be far greater. So, you know, that's where kind of international perceived standards of best practice somehow come into conflict with local realities, and what you've got to apply is a good dose of common sense.
Great, thanks so much, Asherton. That was a really good way to finish the Q&A there on the term common sense. So I think we'll close up the Q&A. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. So a really big thank you to all of our panelists and speakers today. So Asherton, Jill, Erin, and Pete. It's been really great to hear all your insights, and thanks for participating. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll be in touch with further links and information about the consultation. Thanks to our speakers again. Bye.